Well, good evening, everyone. It truly is a great privilege to be able to join with you tonight, and I just want to thank Pastor Paul for the invitation, Pastor Ben for the invitation for me to be able to come tonight. After a meeting a couple of years ago, a lady came up to me, and she was smiling brightly, which is always encouraging. It's the ones who come to you with a scowl that I worry about. And she said, I just wanted you to know that today was going to be the last Sunday that I came to church, because I've been struggling with my faith over so many unanswered issues. And she said the pastor had announced that there was a visiting speaker coming, and so I thought, okay, I'll go this Sunday, but this is the last time because Christianity makes no sense to me. And she said, I just want to tell you that you answered all the questions that have been haunting me for years, and I want to thank you for that. So I just, you can imagine what that does to your spirit. It's so encouraging to hear. And the heart of our ministry is to encourage people in their faith. I guess we also are pretty keen to try and weaken the faith of those who believe in evolution, because we don't believe that evolution is a true and accurate representation of the history of this world. So what I want to talk about this evening, is this subject, going where the evidence leads. Yes, I am awake, but only just. And you might wonder about this title, but you see, often Christians are told, you Christians believe things in spite of the evidence. In other words, you have blind faith. But I actually think that it's the other way around. I think that the Christian stands on a very reasonable and very defensible foundation, and that the faith of the Christian is in fact an entirely reasonable one. You see, the Bible says that God created the heavens and the earth right at the very beginning, that he did it in 6 normal length days, just like the days we experience now, and that he spoke the universe into being. It gives a magnificent picture of his majesty, power, might, and his loving compassion in creation. But it all rests upon, in the beginning, God. There is a causal agent for this universe. It didn't come about for no reason and by itself. But in our culture, we're told something different. We're told that the universe came about through random, accidental, natural processes, and we have to understand our origins purely in naturalistic terms. So the evolutionary story involves deep time, billions and billions of years. It specifically excludes a guiding hand, because if there was a guiding hand, then you would have a God. You see, what our culture teaches is an explanation, or attempts an explanation at origins, in purely natural terms. Now, if you're involved in the sciences, as I have been for many years, that sounds pretty reasonable, because you want to have explanations for things. How does it work? But if you think about it, if you limit yourself to purely naturalistic explanations for everything, then what you're actually doing right at the outset, and arbitrarily, is you are excluding a supernatural explanation for the universe. Now, if you exclude the supernatural, that's the same as saying there is no God. So the evolutionary story, by seeking to explain the universe without God, is actually resting on that premise. There is no God. That means that it is inherently atheistic. So you can think of it like this, I suppose, that evolution as taught in our culture is really atheism dressed up in a lab coat. So it sounds very authoritative, it comes with all the weight of the scientific establishment, but in fact it's teaching us that the universe got here by accident, there's no God, and by the way, you Christians believe things by blind faith. Now, I know that there are Christians who believe that God used evolution to create, so I'm not trying to establish some kind of false dichotomy here. And in fact, I used to believe that God used evolution to create, but I found that that in fact doesn't stack up. It's inconsistent with the scriptures, and in fact it really does not provide a satisfactory explanation for why this world is the way it is. Now, very often people challenge us by saying, does this issue even really matter? And I think it does, and just like that lady who came to me after the church service, it definitely mattered for her. I want to share this extract from a letter that this gentleman wrote to us because I think it illustrates why this matters so much. And he wrote, "I was raised in the church until my teens before rejecting it and declaring myself an atheist agnostic. The creation-evolution issue was the number one sticking point for me. How could I possibly believe the Bible if it is wrong from the very start?" If you think about it, it's a good point, isn't it? You see, if the Bible is demonstrated to be wrong in its opening chapters, how can you be sure other bits are right and not wrong? And I guess the worst part is, how can you tell which bits are right and which bits are wrong? Now, this was a good news story because this guy was writing to us about his salvation. He came across our website and some of our materials encouraged him to have confidence in the Word of God, and that ultimately led to his salvation. The Bible tells us that we are to always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have, but to do this with gentleness and respect. And that's what our ministry is about. It's about equipping you to be able to give answers. Now, you don't have to know all the answers, no one does, but I want to encourage you to grasp that there are answers to the challenges that the Christian is presented with in our technological age, and to know where to find them. I want to share just another illustration. This gentleman, many of you will know, Dan Brown, is the author of the book, The Da Vinci Code, which was then a movie, and he's written some other things as well. And he was interviewed and gave a little bit of a snapshot of his upbringing. He said, "I was raised Episcopalian and I was very religious as a kid. Then in 8th or 9th grade, I studied astronomy, cosmology, and the origins of the universe. I remember saying to a minister, 'I don't get it. I read a book that said there was an explosion known as the Big Bang, but here it says God created the heavens and the earth in 7 days. Which is right?' Unfortunately, the response I got was, 'Nice boys don't ask that question.' A light went off and I said, 'The Bible doesn't make sense. Science makes much more sense to me,' and I just gravitated away from religion." How sad that that minister was not prepared to give an account of the hope that he had. If that young man, Dan Brown, had received a good Bible-based answer, what a difference that might have made to his life and to many others who have been influenced by his writings. So I don't believe this issue of origins is a side issue by any means, and this is supported by some very sound and recent survey work. Back in 2017, just a couple of years ago, McCrindle Research found that over a half of all Australians say science and evolution is an issue that blocks their interest in Christianity. Now, if you're keen on sharing your faith, to know that half of our population find this issue as a blockage, I think that's important, don't you? And they went on and found that 1 in 3 say it blocks them significantly or completely. Just late last year, the Barnard Group published the results of a global survey they did, but it included specific data for Australia and New Zealand. They were surveying the 18 to 35-year-old age group, and I notice we have some representatives of that here tonight, which is great, called the millennials or Generation Z or whatever term. And they were asking them, what are the issues that block your interest in spiritual things? And there was a whole variety of them along here: hypocrisy of religious people and history, my upbringing, for instance, and so on. But the number one issue in Australia and New Zealand was science. And it was only just number 2 on a global scale, with the hypocrisy matter being just slightly ahead. So that says that this really is an important issue that the church needs to address. We can't simply ignore it if we are serious about sharing our faith. Now, David Kinesin, who is the president of the Barnard Group, said at the conference last year in October, the next generation have questions that the church is not prepared to answer. But remember what 1 Peter 3:15 said? Always be prepared. Can the church help the next generation think through the questions that they have with robust answers? Well, that's what CMI is about, and we are very privileged to be able to share with you tonight. We've brought lots of materials and books and DVDs up the back. Perhaps the most vital of all of those, and I'll tell you more about it later, is our Creation magazine. A lot of the illustrations I'm going to use in tonight's talk come from past issues of the Creation magazine. We also have some free things. This is our website. It has a search window up here on the top right-hand corner. You just type keywords into that. It gives you access to some 11,000 different articles and items of interest. There's a new feature article there on the front page, 6 days of every week. We encourage people to go and read that and to get equipped dealing with the questions and issues that arise. Now, one of the really good things about our website is that it's very easy to remember. Now, I find, however, nonetheless, that if you say something at the same time as seeing it, it helps to imprint it into your memory. So I want you to say the web address with me when it comes up onto the screen. So is everybody ready for that? Okay, so if you want to know anything about creation, you just go to... Couldn't be easier, could it? We also have a free email newsletter service. We call it InfoBytes, and this is an approximately weekly digest of the best of the daily articles on creation.com. Saves you time and effort, so you don't miss out on something important that would encourage you in your witnessing. Now, you may be thinking, oh, not another email, and I well understand that. But I do encourage you to sign up if you have not, because this really is a great way to stay up to date with things that are happening. Now, up the back on the tables, you'll find a little leaflet like this. Is a whole stack. There's 6 different types, actually, that have a rather interesting little factoid on the reverse side, which can really only be explained from a biblical point of view. And there's a spot there where you can put your name and your email address. Now, if you give us your postcode, then if something's happening in your area, like this meeting, then we can let you know about it. With your first email, you'll get access to a full-length video presentation. And remember, this is a great way to stay up to date. Now, I had the very great privilege of being involved in the aerospace industry for some 30 or so years, and delighted to see one of my colleagues, Dr. Philip Lowe, here tonight. He and I worked on the design of that particular satellite, for instance. And it was a lot of fun, and being involved in the aerospace industry is quite exciting. It's kind of out there on the sort of leading edge, and also, you know, people think it's just wonderful. And my fingerprints are in orbit, by the way, you might be interested to know. Not that that means anything. But the kind of science that I've been involved in is what you could call experimental science. It's the sort of science which gives us amazing inventions like communication satellites and mobile phones, computers and the like. But the important thing about experimental science is that it's based on observable, repeatable experiments. So a scientist can conduct an experiment in one part of the world, and someone else in another part can repeat that experiment and demonstrate whether the first guy was right or wrong, or maybe modify things. And that's how our understanding of how the universe works progresses. And that is the kind of science which leads to all these amazing inventions and things that we take for granted. But remember, it's based on observable, repeatable experiments. But there's another kind of science that we could call historical science. Now, in historical science, the scientist looks at evidence in the present, and then he makes up a story about the past to explain what he's observing in the present. Now, when the scientist makes up a story about the unobserved past, he engages, and if you think about it, this is inevitable, he engages his beliefs about the origins of this thing he's examining. So if he believes the evolutionary story with its natural processes, deep time, and so on, then the story he tells to explain what he's observing will reflect what he believes. Now, in this particular case, this guy has observed in this rock a couple of bones and some teeth, and so he makes up a story. Now, it turns out he believes the evolutionary story, which most people do because that's what we're taught in our education system, right? And he thought, well, maybe, the skull might look like that, but then he went on and he concluded that this creature was actually a missing link between land mammals and later sea mammals. Now, we didn't just make that up. That diagram or that image came from a technical paper. This creature was called Pachycetus, and they were very confident about Pachycetus. They said in time and in its morphology, that means its shape, Pachycetus is perfectly intermediate, a missing link between earlier land mammals and later full-fledged whales. But remember what they'd found. Just that little chunk of bone and a skull and some teeth. Now, but very confident nonetheless, very confident words. Now, 7 years later, they found a full skeleton of Pachycetus, and now they think that he looks like this. Now, it's very different, isn't it? Very different. So where are the confident words now? But you see, when you get more evidence, more data, there's less room for imagination, isn't there? And I think just about all, if not all, of the claimed transitional fossils that we hear about in our biology textbooks and so on are in this category. Small fragments of actual data or evidence and lots of imagination. Now, National Geographic had a bit of a go a while back to try and figure out how a cow, a land mammal, might become a sea mammal. So on the left-hand side, you have a real animal. On the right, you have a real one. These images in between are purely imaginary, for which there is no fossil evidence whatsoever. But if you think about it, how would a land mammal become a sea mammal? It's a bit of a challenge, isn't it? Unless it was something like this. So let's just summarise that. Experimental science, it's about observable, repeatable experiments. But historical science is about the unobservable, unrepeatable past. And friends, it's only in this area of historical science that any conflict at all takes place. There is never any conflict between science and the Bible in the realm of experimental or operational science. It's only when one group tells a story about the past that begins with the assumption there's no God, and therefore we have to have naturalistic explanations for everything, that story conflicts with what the Bible says, which of course begins with God, the Creator. So you can imagine a courtroom, the prosecution stands up and looks at the evidence, and he interprets the evidence as meaning that the accused is guilty. And then the defence lawyer stands up and he looks at exactly the same evidence and he interprets it as meaning that the accused is innocent. Same evidence, but radically different interpretations. So just like the court case, what we need is an eyewitness account. Someone who was there. That's how we can discover the truth about our origins. And friends, we have just exactly that in this book, the Bible. See, the Bible is God's eyewitness account of what he did right at the very beginning. Now, I happen to believe that the Bible is God's word. Is anyone here with me on that tonight? Yeah, one or two of you, that's good. So, we have the eyewitness account. And, of course, one takes a step of faith to believe that. But, as I want to show you, it is a defensible step of faith. So is your faith, and by the way, everybody has faith in their origins. None of us were able to be there to observe it. But is your faith supported by evidence? And I want to use two images tonight. This first one, this little girl is taking a tentative step into a pond or a lake. Now she can see the ground underneath, through the water. She knows she's not going to drop into some kind of great abyss. But nonetheless, it still takes a small step of faith, doesn't it, to take that step. Now, I want to use this image to depict a leap of faith. Now, you hope that this guy has checked that the water's deep enough, there are no rocks and so on. So this would be believing something in spite of or in the absence of any evidence. Now let's imagine you're out in the countryside and you come across this old rusting car. Now you look at that and you know that there was a time in the past when it was a brand spanking new vehicle rolling off the production line. So you know that there had to be a beginning, because there it is running down, but it has not yet run down. It must have had a beginning. You know the same is true of our universe. The stars in the universe are burning up their thermonuclear fuel. That energy is being dissipated throughout the universe as heat and light. Cosmologists tell us that we are heading for a heat death, which will be the end. So that means there had to have been a beginning, because the universe has not yet run down. Now, the usual story about this beginning, oh, by the way, there's much discussion in secular circles, because if you say there's a beginning to the universe, it smells awfully like there was a God who began it. And so there are some who try to resist it. But this article in New Scientist, I think, really nailed it well. And the headline here is The Death of the Eternal Cosmos. From the cosmic egg to infinite universe, every model of the universe has a beginning. And that little title down there says, Space-time cannot possibly be eternal in the past. There must have been some kind of boundary. Now, they use jargon. A boundary means a beginning in this context. And the beginning that we hear all the time is the Big Bang story, isn't it? And I'm sure you've all heard about it. Even if you haven't studied it, you would have heard about it looking at TV documentaries and the like. And it's something like this, that 13.7 or 8 billion years ago, there was a quantum fluctuation. Absolutely nothing became absolutely everything. It was initially in the form of a hot plasma gas, which then condensed down into, condensed down into stars and galaxies and the like. Some of those exploded into supernovas, and more complex molecules were formed. And then we had this swirling cloud of dust and gas, and our sun condensed out at the centre, and then the planets formed, and more complex molecules appeared. And finally, on planet Earth, down here in the bottom right-hand corner, this double helix structured molecule with all of these nucleotides, base pairs in there, with all the information to make every living organism appeared. So that, in a nutshell, if you like, is the Big Bang story. Now, someone a little bit tongue-in-cheek said, now students, hydrogen is a gas which, if left long enough, turns into people. Well, you know, I want to share a couple of images with you, but first of all, let's just think about this concept of an explosion leading to a highly complex, structured and ordered universe. That doesn't fit with my life experience. Whenever I've seen the results of an explosion, it's always left a random field of debris. No structure and order is formed. This building, for instance, didn't come about through an explosion in a brick pit, right? It was designed, people brought the raw materials, it was constructed. And we can tell because it's got structure and order. It's not the result of an accidental process. Now, this next image will come as a shock to many of you here tonight, possibly all of you. So I want to prepare you for it, but you need to know that this is not my daughter's bedroom. And I'm sure you've never seen anything like it. Is that right? Now, if this idea of an explosion leading to structure and order was true, all you'd need to do is ask the young lady to leave the room, create an explosion, and hey presto, it would all look like that. But of course, we know full well that's not what happens, is it? You see, in real life, in this case, you'd probably need some discipline. Then you need some intelligence and some hard work. And that's how you get things that are structured and ordered. But then people say, yeah, but hang on a minute, the Earth is not a closed system. There's the sun out there and it shines heat and light down onto the surface of the Earth. And that's how all the chaos became ordered, harnessing the energy from the sun. So let's think about that for a minute. Here's a machine that's very cleverly designed to convert the energy in the chemical bonds of petrol into mechanical energy that then, driven through your gearbox, makes your car proceed. So it's a controlled application of raw energy in an intelligently designed environment. But you could take exactly the same fuel, pour it over the car and ignite it, and you get a different result, don't you? You see, this is an uncontrolled application of raw energy in an unintelligent and undesigned environment. So just plain energy does not cut it. We need to have intelligence exercised onto matter to organise it into structure and order. In fact, Professor Paul Davies summed it up very well. He said, the Big Bang represents the instantaneous suspension of physical laws, the sudden abrupt flash of lawlessness that allowed something to come out of nothing. It represents a true miracle. So to believe that the universe made itself, which the secular atheistic evolutionist must believe, is actually a huge leap of faith. Why? Because the evidence does not support that view. But to believe that the universe was made is oh so tiny a step of faith, because all the evidence points that way. Now, as we open the history book of the universe, the Bible, we discover that it lays out a very clear timeline of all history. So we read that Adam was made on the 6th day of creation, and following the chronogenealogies in the first chapters of Genesis all the way through to Abraham, we can conclude that Abraham was born about 2,000 years after creation. From the time of Abraham through to David, and then via the line of Mary and the line of Joseph to the time of Jesus, is also about 2,000 years. And of course, from the time of Jesus to the present day is about 2,000 years. So according to the Bible, not my idea, here we stand about 6,000 years after the creation. Now that's a pretty stunning conclusion, isn't it? 6,000 years. I mean, we hear so much about the billions of years, right? How could anyone seriously believe that the Earth is that young? What do you do with all this evidence? Well, let's just have a little bit of a look at how we determine the age of something. We hear so much about the ages of fossils and rocks, don't we? But, you know, age cannot be measured. Ages are always calculated. And let me explain. Imagine that you've just come around the corner of your house into your backyard, and there underneath a dripping tap is a bucket that's partly filled with water. Now, because you're scientifically inclined, you can't help yourself. You measure the volume of water in the bucket and the rate at which the tap is dripping, as you do. And you ask yourself that all-important question, how long has the bucket been under the tap? Now, this is quiz time, so I hope you're all awake. We have 6 litres of water in the bucket. Now, if you don't get this right, by the way, there's no supper, so just no pressure, no pressure. You have 6 litres of water in the bucket, and the tap is dripping at the rate of half a litre every hour. So who can tell me how long that bucket's been under the tap? Any takers? 12 hours. Who thinks 12 hours? Who agrees? Yep, 12 hours. Yeah, could be right, could be, but let's think about it a minute. You have just chanced upon the scene. You did not see the bucket put under the tap. So you're doing your science and your measurements in the present, like all science is done. So to get 12 hours, we actually made some assumptions. What did we assume to get 12 hours? Sorry? That the bucket was empty. You see, we don't know that. You weren't there to see it, were you? What if the bucket was already half full? 12 hours would be wrong, wouldn't it? Might only have been 6. What else did we assume? Constant drip rate. Don't know that either. What if somebody had turned the tap on hard, partly filled the bucket, turned the tap off carelessly, left it dripping, and walked away just seconds before you came around the corner? You'd be completely wrong. Anything else? You're assuming there's no hole in the bottom of the bucket. I heard evaporation over here. Any others? It's all sorts. Someone called out once the dog might have had a drink out of the bucket. All of these things are true. You see, there's any number of ways you can get water into or out of the bucket. It might have rained, right? I wish it did. Before you turned up. And you have absolutely no way of knowing. But you have a very important backyard. And in your backyard, there is a resident historian who faithfully records all the events in your backyard. And the historian tells you that at 1:05 this afternoon, the bucket was placed under the tap, and at 1:50 you came round the corner. So now you ask, how long has the bucket been under the tap? Who wants to have a go at that? 45 minutes, right? But I might say to you, no, look, you're just a historian. I'm a scientist, right? And we have amazing technology that can measure the volume of water in buckets by measuring the very molecules, counting them. And we can measure the drip rates of taps to the nearest, I don't know, millilitre per month. And when you apply all that amazing technology to the problem, you're right, it's not 12 hours. Actually, it was 11.973261 or whatever. In other words, all the way down to the nearest microsecond. But am I any closer to the correct answer with all my technology? Who thinks I am? Who thinks I'm not? Who's not sure? You see, even with all that technology, you still have to make the same assumptions because you didn't observe the bucket until you were there doing your measurements. So you don't know all of the initial conditions. So let's summarise all of that. Age cannot be measured. Ages are always calculated. And you know what? The calculations are based on assumptions, and you can get any age you like depending on the assumptions that you make. But the worst thing is you can't test your assumptions because you can't go back into the past. So the only way you can determine the age of something is by a reliable historical record. So friends, this is tremendously important that we grasp this point. When you see the age of something, you need to ask yourself the question right away, what is the assumed history behind that age? Ages only come from historical records. They cannot be determined by measurement in the present. So if it's the evolutionary story, which begins with the assumption there's no God, you'll get deep time and vast ages. But if your assumption is that the Bible is true and God created just a few thousand years ago, you'll get a very different answer, won't you? So let's take a look at some illustrations. Now, radiometric dating is probably the one thing that is held up as the means by which scientists have established the vast age of the Earth. But radiometric dating is a little bit like an hourglass, if you will. There's a parent element that decays at a certain rate, and it forms what's called the daughter element. Now, if you can measure the ratio of the parent element to the daughter element, you can determine the age of your sample. But remember the bucket of water? It's the same principles apply. You see, we weren't there to determine the initial quantity of the parent element. We don't know if some has been added or subtracted. Likewise with the daughter element, we don't know the initial quantity. We presume it's all radiogenic, caused by the radioactive decay process, but we don't know if some's been added or subtracted, which it can be, by the way. Various salts are in fact water soluble. They can be leached into and out of rocks. And lastly, we don't know that the decay rate has actually been constant. But what we can do is test some rocks using some dating methods, rocks that have a known age. Now, how do you get a rock of a known age? Well, a good way is to go to a volcanic eruption that happened in the past and the lava has now solidified, becomes basalt, and there's a clock called the potassium-argon clock that starts ticking when it solidifies. Argon's an inert gas. It bubbles out of molten lava, but it gets trapped in the rock. So it should give us a good measure of the age of the basalt. So here's some examples. Mount St. Helens, it erupted in 1980. Potassium-argon dates from samples taken from that 1980 lava flow gave ages anywhere from 350,000 to 2.8 million years. And there was a range of samples taken. Here in Hawaii, Kilauea, which interestingly enough a couple of years ago was erupting again, you might have seen in the news. There was an eruption some 200 years ago. Rocks from that lava flow were dated between 0 and 22 million years. Here, Hualalai, also in Hawaii, once again about 200 years ago, 160 million to 3.3 billion years. So, friends, we get results that are not correct for rocks that have a known age. So, if you get a rock of known age and you get the wrong results, why should we have confidence in the ages we get for rocks of unknown age? How can we tell? Not only that, different dating methods should give about the same results for things that must be about the same age. For instance, in Crinum in Queensland, there was a mine. 21 metres down, they discovered a layer of basalt, which was potassium argon dated at 45 million years. But the lava had flowed through and over a forest, and there was charred wood, still wood, that was brought up. The wood was carbon dated to be 44 to 45,000 years old. Now, those things must be about the same age because the lava had flowed through the forest, and yet they are vastly different from those two different measurements. I like this little quote: if a carbon-14 date supports our theories, we put it in the main text. If it does not entirely contradict them, we put it in a footnote. And if it's completely out of date, we just drop it. Now, I'm not trying to make fun of scientists here because I am one. I'm an engineer actually, but other science degrees as well, but that'll do. You see, what this reflects is how our belief systems work. And you know, we're all the same. We all have a belief system, and we all filter everything we hear, see, read, and what have you through that belief system. So what's happened here is they have an expectation or a belief about how old their sample should be. And when the data comes back and doesn't fit, well, what do? You haven't got enough money to send it back to the laboratory. It's a very expensive process. So you rationalise it. You might think, well, maybe there were some impurities. Maybe the equipment was out of calibration, or maybe the lab technician had afternoon tea in the middle, or who knows. But if it doesn't fit, we just drop it. But radiocarbon, or carbon-14, is actually a real friend of biblical creationists. And let me explain why. Ladies, some of you here today may have a diamond on your finger. It's called a girl's best friend, isn't it? Now, diamonds are the hardest naturally occurring form of carbon. You can't get impurities into or out of a diamond. There is a radioactively unstable form of carbon, that's carbon-14, that decays quite rapidly. So rapidly, in fact, that after about 60 to 80,000 years, you would not be able to detect any. So if the diamonds are actually 1 to 3 billion years old, as is believed in the evolutionary model, there could not possibly be carbon-14 inside diamonds. A range of diamonds, not just one, several were taken and tested some years ago now, and carbon-14 was found in every single one, indicating that they could only be thousands of years old, not billions. But thousands of years fits with the timescale outlined in the Bible. We had an article in our Creation magazine. We called it Diamonds, a Creationist's Best Friend. It turns up routinely in coal, which is supposed to be some tens to hundreds of millions of years old, should be no carbon-14 present, but it's found in every single sample, showing an age of only thousands of years, once again consistent with the biblical account. In the Latrobe Valley in Victoria, the coal measures there are some 700 metres thick. They contain partly, but not wholly, decomposed vegetation. And the deposition is consistent with massive flooding. Now, there's a theory about how coal forms. It's the swamp theory that says there's this tranquil swamp and bits of vegetation and material drop into this and rots, and it slowly builds up layer upon layer and compresses, and after many millions of years you end up with coal. But in the Latrobe Valley, for instance, that theory fails because there is no soil under the coal, but pure clay, and there are no roots. There are horizontal ash layers that run through the coal measures. Now that speaks of volcanic eruptions, which is hardly a tranquil environment. And there are large pine trees that are randomly distributed throughout the coal. Things like King Billy pines, which, interestingly, don't grow in swamps. So the swamp theory is not supported by the observable evidence. By the way, it doesn't take millions of years to form coal. It can be made rapidly in a laboratory. The most important factor is temperature. So if you take the basic ingredients, lignin, water and clay, and you heat it only to modest temperatures, you can produce brown coal in a matter of months, or at higher temperatures, high quality anthracite or black coal. And I want to quote one of my colleagues, Taz Walker, who said, "If ever there was a geological phenomenon that should remind us of Noah's flood, coal points to a global catastrophe, because huge quantities of vegetation have been uprooted, transported and buried by water under great volumes of sediment all over the world." So coal, in fact, is consistent with the Bible's record of history, and in particular, the flood of Noah. But there are lots of other examples we could use of processes happening in nature and geology. The White Cliffs of Dover, for instance, it was believed that they were deposited 65 million years ago in the late Cretaceous. They are eroding at the rate of a metre every 6 years. And at that rate for that period, the coast would have receded about 10,000 kilometres, which of course is ridiculous. Now, no one is suggesting that that's what has happened, but the point is that what we observe today is consistent with the Bible's record of history, but it's completely inconsistent with the evolutionary story. But you know, it's not just here on planet Earth. Out in our solar system, the planet Uranus has a bunch of tightly grouped moons, 13 of them, whose orbit radii differ by only 10,000 kilometres, which means that they pass by each other very slowly. They will gravitationally interact, their orbits will become disturbed, and in fact they're going to collide. In only about 1 million years, Cressida will probably strike Desdemona. A similar fate awaits the moon Cupid and Belinda, which will hit each other. Obviously these scientists must have read Shakespeare when they were naming them. But the point is this: those moons could not have been orbiting the planet Uranus for millions and millions of years, or billions. They could only have been there for a relatively short time. Once again, not consistent with the evolutionary story, but consistent with the biblical account. And just look around us on our planet. There are about 7.5 billion people. You know, if you take 6 people, Noah's 3 sons, Shem, Ham and Japheth, and their wives, let that population grow at the rate of just under 0.5%, you know what you get after 4,500 years? You get about 7.5 billion people. So the population of the world today is consistent with the biblical creation story, but it's not consistent with the evolutionary story, because mankind is supposed to have been here for at least 100,000 years. So if that was true, we should be shoulder to shoulder on every square metre of the planet's surface, including the ocean basins, and then some. But it's not like that, is it? You know, there are so many different illustrations I could give. There's a marvellous article on our website called The Age of the Earth. You can find it at creation.com/age, and it lists 101 ways you can place an upper limit on the age of the Earth and the universe, all of which are inconsistent with the evolutionary story. You know, it's a huge leap of faith to believe that the Earth is billions of years old, because, you know, the evidence does not support that view. But what a tiny step of faith to believe that the Earth is just thousands of years old, because the evidence is all in favour of that. Let's turn our attention briefly to geology now. This is the planet where I live. I had a youth group a while ago, and I wasn't sure whether they lived on the same one, but anyway. It's interesting, but it was in the discipline of geology that this idea of the vast antiquity of the Earth first arose. And it came about like this. People would look at rock formations like the Grand Canyon, and they applied a philosophy. And the philosophy has a name, like they all do. It's called uniformitarianism. You might have heard that little catchphrase, the present is the key to the past. So we constrain ourselves to interpreting all of geology in terms of the processes we can see happening now. Now, it sounds all right, but what uniformitarianism actually does is deny the possibility of a past catastrophe that we now don't observe. So you look at a little river flowing along, and it erodes its banks and it takes the sediment out to the sea, and very slowly it creates a valley. So when you look at something like this, you have to say each of those layers must have been laid down by some kind of a flood or catastrophe, and then another one on top of that, and then another and another, and so on over millions of years. All of those layers of rock were laid down. And then along comes the Colorado River, and it slowly erodes this massive canyon. It must have taken millions of years. So it's obvious, isn't it? You look at that, millions of years. How could anyone think otherwise? But let's have a close look. Here are 2 layers, the Coconino Sandstone, the top one, that light-coloured layer, and underneath is the Hermit Formation. And there's a very sharply defined boundary between the two. Now, the conventional uniformitarian view has it that there is a 10 million year gap between those 2 layers. Okay, that says that the Hermit Formation lay there with a flat top for 10 million years before the Coconino sandstone was deposited. But wouldn't you expect to see some evidence of elapsed time? I mean, surely you would see signs of vegetation, tree roots or animal burrows, and the next time it rained, surely there would be some erosion, creeks, rivers, valleys and the like. But friends, for the hundreds of kilometres that contact is exposed in Grand Canyon, there is no evidence of erosion anywhere. You see, what it actually speaks of is a rapid deposition of one layer after the other with very little, if any, elapsed time between them. In fact, there's a good case to be made for simultaneous deposition through a massive flow of floodwater. So have we ever seen anything like that form rapidly? Well, actually, we have. In 1980, Mount St. Helens erupted in Washington State in the US, and it changed the geology around the base of the mountain, including the formation of this structure, which is called Little Grand Canyon. Now, I hope you can see here on the walls of the canyon, there are all these different layers, and down the bottom here, you'll see this little river flowing. So if you applied that uniformitarian explanation, you'd have to say all that material took a long time to form, and that little river must have taken a tremendous amount of time to carve out that canyon. Now, that's 1/40th the size of the real Grand Canyon. But friends, none of that material was even there before 1980. So how do we know? Well, we observed it to happen. Remember what science was about? It's about observation. Now, 2 years after the eruption, there was the breach of a natural dam, and there was a great mud flow through that area, and that mud flow carved out Little Grand Canyon. Well, how long do you think it might have taken to carve out a canyon 1/40th the size of the Grand Canyon? I mean, who thinks it would have taken at least a month to do that? Anyone? You're all very suspicious. You think I'm going to trap you, don't you? All right, I'll tell you. It took just 1 day. 1 day. 1/40th the size of Grand Canyon. How do we know? We observed it to happen. That's what science is about. You know, the Bible describes just such a cataclysmic global event. All the springs of the great deep burst forth and the floodgates of the heavens were opened, the Bible tells us. And the waters rose and increased greatly on the earth, and all the high mountains under the entire heavens were covered. Sometimes people say, yes, but it might have been a local flood, you see. These old Jews, they just observed this flood in the Mesopotamian River Valley, and they wrote about it, and it seemed so big that they thought it must have been global. But let's think about what the words say here. All the high mountains under the entire heavens were covered. And God did promise not to send another flood like that, didn't he? See that rainbow? It reminds us that God will never again destroy the earth with a flood. Really? My Christian college professor said Noah's flood was confined to the Middle East. So he believes God will never send another local flood. You see, how often has God broken his promise, if that's what it was? And by the way, why not just migrate to another country? Why build an ark? Why have birds on it? You see, the local flood idea makes no sense whatsoever. And how does it stack up with all the high mountains under the entire heavens? I mean, how could that be? Clearly not like that. And then people say, but where did all the water go? You know, it's one of those gotcha questions. You ever had one of those? Gotcha. So it's a good question. Where did all the water go? Well, if you look at our planet, there's actually a lot of water out there. Down in the lower left-hand side, you can see Australia. Up here is the west coast of the US. Do you know, if you could take the ocean basins and raise them, and the continents and lower them, so that the Earth was a perfect sphere, the water of the oceans would cover the Earth to a depth of nearly 3,000 metres. There is a lot of water out there. Everywhere we look on this planet, we see the telltale signs of a watery, volcanic, violent catastrophe. Here on Austin Beach, you'll see a coal-bearing layer, an ash layer, coal-bearing layer, ash, coal, sedimentary rock on top. It speaks of a massive and rapid disaster. We find fossil tree trunks that run through multiple layers of rock. If each of those layers took thousands of years to form, the tree trunk would long since have rotted away, wouldn't it? Rather, it speaks of violent, rapid emplacement of that tree in freshly laid sediments. I want to play a short clip from our DVD, Evolution's Achilles Heels. And this shows some really interesting footage of mountains that have been formed as a result of Noah's flood.
But there are some things about modern mountain beds that we see that don't seem to fit with this conventional view. Rock is brittle. It doesn't bend very easily. If you try and bend it, it breaks. Now, granted, on a big scale, you might be able to get some pretty big bends out of a large rock. But these bends are tight and close, and you can walk from one end of them to the other. This type of bend and folding without breaking brittle rock means that maybe it wasn't brittle rock at the time of its formation. These might have been much softer materials. After all, they were laid down during Noah's flood. They've been compacted down, started off horizontal, but then as the tectonic movements occurred, they shifted and folded them while they were probably still soft. So when we look at it this way, what we realize is that the really tall mountain chains, the Alps, the Rockies, the Himalayas, they didn't exist before the flood. The whole reason that they exist is because of the flood.
So basically, when we look at the geology of the Earth, we find that present processes do not explain what we see. Rather, what we see points to catastrophic processes in the past. And when we think about what those could be, it fits exactly with the account in Genesis of Noah's flood, which destroyed the whole Earth.
So, friend, I think it's a massive leap of faith to believe that gradual processes shaped the major geological features of our planet. But what a tiny step of faith to believe that a global flood best describes the major geological features. Now, let's just touch quickly on this question of the origin of life. It's called chemical evolution. And quoting Professor Paul Davies again, nobody knows how a mixture of lifeless chemicals spontaneously organised themselves into the first living cell. And that doesn't mean that he doesn't believe it happened, by the way, just that he says nobody knows how it could have happened. And if you think about it, how could this laptop of mine accidentally have formed with its motherboard and power supply and screen and keyboard and battery and all the rest of it? I mean, it's ridiculous to suggest. But even if it did, it would be useless without something else. See, it needs to have a software control system, doesn't it? Just hardware is useless. So Davies goes on and says, how did stupid atoms spontaneously write their own software? Because every single cell in your body or in any living organism operates under stored program control, and that is written onto the DNA. So if we could imagine a single cell, it would be, if we could look inside it, we'd see staggering complexity with all kinds of different things in it, power supplies, communication networks, temperature control systems. There's even a postal service where this little guy called a motor kinesin carries proteins in a big sack from factories where they've been made to different parts of the cell where they are required to operate. And I want to play a very short video clip that gives some insight into what this little thing looks like. It's called a linear Kinesin motor, and this is based upon electron microscope and other imaging technologies, so the shapes are real. The colours are just there for artistic purposes, but have a look at this little guy.
Inside a living cell is an amazing transportation system. Proteins have to be delivered to the correct part of the cell to perform their intended functions. This animation, based on a lot of clever research over a number of years, shows how it happens. Highways made of microtubules are assembled by interlocking proteins, each manufactured in accordance with the coded instructions on the cell's DNA. Marching along a microtubule is the Kinesin Motor, the hero of our story, carrying a huge stack of proteins to be delivered to a predetermined place in the cell. Here, the proteins will be released to fulfill their functions. A Kinesin motor uses one ATP to provide the energy for each step and takes 125,000 steps to cover 1 millimetre. This amazing machine shows all the hallmarks of design.
What an amazing little guy. That's what he does. That's slowed right down, right? He goes a lot faster than that. Not too sure about the dance at the end, but you can see what extraordinary technology there is inside every cell. That's just one little part of it. Professor Sir Fred Hoyle, who is not a Christian but an astute scientist, said, "The probability of the formation of just one of the many proteins on which life depends is comparable to that of the solar." Now, think about this. The solar system packed full of blind people randomly shuffling Rubik's cubes and all arriving at the solution at the same time. Can you imagine what that would look like? In other words, it's completely impossible, isn't it? No one seriously would suggest that such a thing could happen. And yet, the atheistic evolutionist has to believe that it did happen by chance. I want to share before I go on to that, Louis Pasteur in the middle 1800s formulated what we now call the Law of Biogenesis, that life only originates from life. And friends, that is observable science. That's what we can see. It's not storytelling, that's from the laboratory. George Wald received the Nobel Prize, very intelligent man, and he spoke about this problem of spontaneous generation or chemical evolution. And he says, one has only to contemplate the magnitude of this task to concede that the spontaneous generation of a living organism is impossible. And you think, wow, he gets it, he gets it. But he goes on and says, yet here we are as a result, I believe, of spontaneous generation. So it's impossible, but I believe it. Reminds me a bit of Alice in Wonderland, you know, wasn't it? Somebody or other had to believe 6 impossible things before breakfast. You see, it's bizarre, isn't it? In fact, it does remind me of Romans 1:22. Professing themselves to be wise, they became fools. Now, I want to play just one more clip here about the origin of life. Once again, from our Evolution's Achilles Heels DVD.
This is not a position they got from science, but a position they got from blind faith. They're basically having to believe in miracles because it's not real chemistry that they can appeal to.
Evolutionists often accuse creationists of believing in a God of the gaps, where they say that we claim God just did it that way when we run into some process that we don't quite understand. But very often, when faced with an unanswerable question, a problem like the origin of life, evolutionists invoke their own Darwin of the gaps. See, everything we know about the laws of chemistry, about genetics and statistics and information theory argues against any life from non-life idea. But an evolutionist must believe that scientific laws are violated for life to arise from non-living chemicals. That sounds like faith to me.
I think one of the biggest challenges for evolution is the origin of the first life. Life supposedly coming forth from a chemical soup. Scientists have had decades to reproduce this in a laboratory, but they haven't been able to do that, despite all the time they've had, despite all the great equipment. And I think that's tremendous evidence that life can't evolve from a chemical soup.
Many evolutionists admit that life from non-living chemicals is a huge problem for life on Earth. So they've resorted to the idea that maybe life came from outside the Earth, and this is called panspermia. Now, there are 2 versions of this one. One is undirected, which just says that chemical evolution happened somewhere and life was naturally seeded onto Earth somehow. Now, this doesn't actually solve the problem of life from non-living chemicals. It just puts it into the unknown. In fact, it puts it beyond science. So you might say it's a Darwin of the gaps theory, not science at all. Another idea is called directed panspermia, where you have intelligent aliens seeding life from outer space onto Earth.
Francis Crick, the primary discoverer of DNA, is one of those scientists we realize it can't happen spontaneously. So he, like other scientists, are imagining that intelligent life from outer space brought life to Earth. And they find that more credible than the idea of spontaneous origin of life.
Evolutionists who resort to directed panspermia are in fact tacitly conceding that life was intelligently designed. The only difference is their designer is an alien, not the God of the Bible. Of course, this is most convenient for them because the God of the Bible has certain moral requirements, while aliens don't. So they can have all the benefits of a designer without the moral obligations to him.
So what a huge leap of faith it is to believe that life arose through time and chance alone. But what a tiny step of faith to believe that life was created. Now, I have something of a crisis here because I have one other topic I wanted to cover, but I've actually technically run out of time. So you can choose. Should I cover the topic of dinosaurs just quickly, or should we wrap up? Who would like dinosaurs? Who would like? Well, I think dinosaurs win. Okay. Well, let me try and do this as quickly as I can. Paleontologists look at the fossil remains of dinosaurs, but you know, they do not have little tags attached to them to say how old they are. Remember we talked about the bucket and the tap, and how do you understand the age of something? You cannot measure it. So when a scientist looks at the fossil remains, he can measure the physical and chemical properties of it. That's operational science. They're the facts that he has. But when he looks at the age or makes pronouncements about the age, that is his interpretation. So that, if you like, is historical science. So what did happen to the dinosaurs? This is a big question people often ask, especially young people. If you've got children or grandchildren, they're bound to ask, how did dinosaurs fit in the Bible? We need to be able to answer that. So what did happen to them? Well, sadly, because most of the secular scientists reject God's historical record of the universe, the Bible, they've had to come up with various explanations of their own. And some of these are really quite fantastic. One theory is that the dinosaurs started eating non-fibrous plants and started to get constipated and died out. So it was called the constipation theory. Another group believed they started eating things like poppies and became addicted to the opiates in them. Naturally, that was called the junkie theory. Another one is that an asteroid impacted the Earth, and of course that's called the asteroid impact theory, which is probably the most popular today. But you know, you can have any theory you like because no one really knows. All we've got is evidence that we observe in the present about something that happened in the past. Now, some of you may remember the cartoonist Gary Larson. I think he had the best explanation for why the dinosaurs became extinct. But from a secular point of view. But what does the Bible say happened to the dinosaurs? Well, a lot of people think, well, it doesn't say anything about dinosaurs, but it actually does. And let me share with you just quickly. The Bible tells us that on the, why is it not advancing? There we go. On the sixth day of creation, God made all the land-dwelling creatures, which must, of course, have included the dinosaurs. But it also tells us that on the sixth day of creation, that God made man. So from those two statements, we can reach a logical conclusion. Who wants to tell me, what can we conclude from those two statements? Yep. That dinosaurs and man must have lived together, exactly. Now, we also know that pairs of all creatures that have the breath of life in them came to Noah and entered the ark. So logical conclusion, there must have been two of every kind of dinosaur on board the ark. And every living thing on the face of the earth was wiped out. Only Noah was left and those with him in the ark. When I say every living thing there, the Bible is quite clear. It means all the land-dwelling, air-breathing creatures, creatures with the breath of life in their nostrils. Logical conclusion, all the dinosaurs not on the ark drowned in the flood. Wow, so that's pretty interesting. So when you go to museums and so on these days, you often see the dinosaurs reconstructed in positions that show what they would have looked like when they were standing. Whoa, what's happening here? Here we go. But I prefer to look at the exhibits that show how they were found. And many of them are like this, in a position with the neck bent back, often the mouth open, the legs and arms outstretched and the tail extended. It's called the opistotonic posture. Now that's a great word. You should learn it and use it next time you're at a party and impress your friends, so long as you're not in that position, of course. So what happens for an animal to get into that position? It comes about through acute oxygen deprivation, like suffocation or drowning, and immediately prior to death, not after death. Now, it's so common, it's called the dinosaur death throes position. My wife and I were at the Royal Tyrrell Museum in Canada just over a year ago, and took this photograph of another one, a Gorgosaurus. You can see once again the classic opistotonic posture, the dinosaur death throes position. And look at this one. This is a T-Rex called Black Beauty. There's Jenny's just down here in the foreground. You can see some idea of how large this huge creature is, but look at it, classic opistotonic posture. If you were to take a truckload of sediment and dump it on the back of a T-Rex, what would he do? Just shake it off and walk away, right? So how do you bury such a huge creature to the point of trapping it and suffocating it unless it was a massive catastrophic event? But you see, all of that is consistent with the Bible's record of a global catastrophic flood. But there is no simple explanation for this from an evolutionary point of view. It requires invoking massive floods all over the earth at different times, just so long as they don't all happen at the same time. And then we read in the Bible, Genesis chapter 8, all the animals and all the creatures came out of the ark, one kind after another. Logical conclusion, 2 of every kind of dinosaur survived the flood. Now, I guess the ones that did would have been pretty happy, right? But what does the evidence say that we can observe today? There was a paleontologist called Mary Schweitzer who was examining a T-Rex bone, and she found that it had red blood cells inside it. She was amazed, and she said it was exactly like looking at a slice of modern bone. But of course, I couldn't believe it. I said to the lab technician, the bones, after all, are 65 million years old. How could blood cells survive that long? Well, friends, they can't. You see, blood cells will break down quite quickly. There's no way they'll survive for 65 million years. A few years later, Mary Schweitzer published again. This time they'd found the femur or the thigh bone of a T-Rex. It was so big they couldn't fit it in their helicopter. They cut the bone in two, and they found it had soft tissue inside, which was flexible and resilient, and when stretched, returned to its original shape. And Mary Schweitzer said, "This is not something I ever dreamed I would see." You know, it's not just Mary Schweitzer finding these things. Many other scientists now are reporting soft tissue like fragments of DNA, bone collagen, proteins, and so on. But it's interesting that in the legends of so many different people groups around the world today, there are stories of encounters between people and huge beasts that are normally called dragons, like St. George and the dragon. And the ancient Chinese divided their calendar up into a cycle of 12 years. And we've just had the new year. We're in the year of the rat right now. But in amongst all of these common, ordinary, everyday animals, this one appears. The dragon. So why would the ancient Chinese have chosen 11 ordinary common animals and then added a mythical one? Far more likely, I believe, they really had encountered huge creatures that they called dragons. Here in Cambodia, in Ta Prohm, is this temple reclaimed from the jungle, and around it are various stone carvings, including this one of an animal with bony plates on its back. Now, when we look at that, what kind of animal would we recognise that as? It's a stegosaur of some variety, right? Now, several hundreds of years ago, when these people were carving that animal, there were no paleontologists around to tell them that the animal they were carving was actually extinct. I'll let you think about that. You see, they carved what they saw, didn't they? So what happened to the dinosaurs that came off the ark? Well, there was a massive change in the environment from before the flood to after the flood. Many of them would not have been able to re-establish their populations. Many did. I believe they went on to become the basis of those legends and stories. I imagine many being hunted to extinction. They would have been a great source of food, and they were dangerous animals. But I think we can make a very strong case that the dinosaurs of history are actually one and the same as the dragons of legend. So it's really a huge leap of faith to believe that the dinosaurs died out 65 million years ago. Because, friends, the evidence does not support that view, but that's all we hear, isn't it? Look at the kids' books on dinosaurs, the evolutionary stories pumped at them all the time. But what a tiny step of faith to believe that the dinosaurs died in the flood, but two of each kind survived. So, friends, let's try and wrap it all up. The Bible says that we are to demolish arguments and every pretension that sets itself up against the knowledge of God. And I'd like to suggest to you this evening that perhaps the greatest pretension that stops people from coming to know God is belief in evolution. And if you think about it, if the universe just made itself by accident, how do you even know there is a God? Or, if you believe that God used the processes of evolution, then his is at best irrelevant. So how can you come to either a non-existent or an irrelevant being? But if you come to the God of the Bible, he's the God who spoke the universe into being in just 6 days, just a few thousand years ago. And he created a perfect world. You see, we need to break down this argument that stops people coming to know God. Well, how do you do it? You can't all become scientists, but that's why our ministry exists. I mentioned Creation magazine earlier on. I have to say that it greatly benefited our own family. We now have, we have 4 now adult children, all busily producing grandchildren for us, which is really wonderful, but they're all walking with the Lord. Wasn't always that way, but they were grounded solidly in the truth of God's word and God as creator. Now, I know the fact that they're walking with the Lord now is by the grace of God, but it is also in part because of their upbringing. You see, if you get hold of the magazine, it gives you wonderful resources. It equips you to answer your children's and your grandchildren's questions. And you'll have an effective witnessing tool to lead your friends into gospel conversations. Let me share just a couple of testimonies with you. This lady wrote to us and said, "Thank you for this much needed magazine. The information empowers Christians to share the gospel." Have you ever felt disempowered by some learned individual who just dumps all this science on you that proves the Bible's wrong? It is disempowering, you know, but you can know with confidence that there are answers to every one of those challenges, and you can know where to find them. And I love this one. I was converted when someone gave me a Creation magazine. How awesome is that? Someone just gave him one, and now he's in the kingdom. But I love what he did next. Then I subscribed for 5 of my relatives. 4 of them have now come to the Lord. That is an awesome testimony. Perhaps I could ask who here already subscribes to, to Creation magazine? Yep, a whole bunch of you. That's great. Well, for those of you who may not, you can subscribe for 1 or 3 years. A subscription brings with you, for you, not only the print copy, but also a digital subscription if you give us an email address. And the beauty of digital is it can be accessed by up to 5 different devices. So parents, that's a great way of giving access to your children to this wonderful faith-building material, or grandparents to your grandchildren. So for a subscription today, you'll receive a bonus back issue, so you have something to take away with you and read, and then hopefully give away to somebody else. Up the back we have these forms. Our helpers there will direct you to them. Just fill them out and indicate what you require. Now, if you take a 3-year subscription, you'll also be eligible for that $15 voucher, which you can use on any of the materials that we have at the back. For instance, the Creation Answers book, which costs $15. If you buy any book at all, I would recommend this one. Consists of 20 short chapters that address the most asked questions that Christians and non-Christians alike have. Many of them we've covered tonight. If you want to dig deep, the Genesis account is a theological, historical and scientific commentary on the first 11 chapters of Genesis. The Evolution's Achilles Heels, the book, written by 9 PhDs. I had the privilege of being one of the contributing authors, and the DVD that we've played several extracts from tonight is available there. There's quite a few books for younger people, including the children's pack, 5 hard-covered books there at just about half price. And just late last year, we released the Genesis Academy. It's a 12 DVD set, which is great for using in study groups or in churches. And it takes you pretty much along the same lines as Dr. Safadie's book, The Genesis Account, that I described earlier. And there's a free study guide available on our website. And of course, don't forget the website at creation.com. So, let me summarise. Why does this matter? The evolutionary story places millions and millions of years of death and struggle and suffering before Adam even appears. The Bible, however, says it was Adam's actions in the garden that led to death and suffering coming into the world. And that is the very reason that Jesus came. That's why this issue is so important, because it's the foundation of the gospel message. Paul says, "For as in Adam all die, even so, in Christ shall all be made alive." You see, the reason Jesus came, and the greatest act of love this universe has ever seen, was to pay the price for our rebellion. But of course, he rose from the dead. He defeated death, and that gives a hope for every single believer. So, friends, he is in fact our risen Saviour. He's the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. He's our intercessor, seated at the right hand of God the Father. He's the bridegroom who's seated at that wedding feast to which we have all been invited. So I want to encourage you tonight to go where the evidence leads, because it all points to the truth of God's word, which in turn points to the person of Jesus. So thank you very much, and I'm sorry I've gone a little long, but we've got a few minutes left, and I'm happy to take any questions that people might have from the floor, and if I can, I will answer them, or if I can't, I hopefully can direct you to some other resources that we have. So, based on that tonight or any other things, yes, sir, you're the first, I think.
Hearing much about the flat Earth theory these days?
Yeah, the question was about flat Earth. There are a number of Christians in various parts of the world now who, sadly, I believe, have been captivated by this idea that the Bible teaches that the earth is flat, which it does not. There are many passages in Scripture which clearly indicate that it's a sphere. And they feel that there's some kind of conspiracy in the scientific community, that the earth is actually flat. And anyway, it's an embarrassment, frankly, for all Christians, because it's very poor exegesis of the Scriptures, and it's blatantly contrary to the observable evidence that we see in the world around us. I mean, Dr. Lowe and I made our careers out of designing and building communication spacecraft which orbit a spherical Earth. What on earth they would do with a flat Earth, I have no idea. It could be that Philip has figured out a way. I don't know. I'll talk to you later. So it's sad. You know, God has given us abundant evidence in the observable world, which is consistent with his word and encourages us in our faith. And we should rely and stand on his word. Yeah, thank you for that. You had a question.
There's been a few articles and things on the website recently, the podcast, that talked about the, like the Angkor Wat engravings and the ones on the pottery and different things as being evidence that people had seen the dinosaurs. It just strikes me that your average 10-year-old today could draw a dinosaur without having had to see one. Was there, and could there have been people who had found bones and created images of what they thought dinosaurs were like prior to our known paleontology beginning in the 1800s?
Yeah, okay, good question. So the question was, we see examples like the one I showed of people who have depicted animals that we recognise now as dinosaurs? Could they, in fact, in centuries past, have found bones and reconstructed them along those lines? Well, there's actually no evidence that they have done that. What is interesting is that the illustrations that people draw can be matched to the fossil remains of dinosaurs that we find today. Now, if they were purely imaginary, you'd expect that there would be a whole bunch that were just out in left field there somewhere or other that bore no relationship to anything. But the bulk of them, by far, with some embellishment, but by and large are consistent with what we observe in the fossil record. There's an excellent book, I think it's up there, the Dire Dragons, should be either on the table or in the sample box, in which Vance Nelson has surveyed a lot of these illustrations, finds, paintings, petroglyphs and so on. Yes, David is holding it up. If you just look quickly, that's the book I'm referring to. It's a coffee table type book, but it's an excellent one. And he shows things like carvings on medieval European castles of various dragons, but then shows how they match to the actual fossil remains of dinosaurs that have been found.
They couldn't have found those fossils themselves.
There's no evidence that they had the ability to do those sorts of reconstructions back then. You've got to remember, our medical knowledge and knowledge of anatomy has come a long way in the relatively recent past. Obviously, they knew how animals went together because they cut them up, right? But there's no evidence that they were doing that sort of thing. Anyway, it's a good question. Have a look on our website. There is an article which does touch on that. I just can't think of its name at the moment, but I'll see if I can find it for you afterwards. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
You mentioned that a lot of Christians believe that God used the evolution process to create. I wonder if you just give us an idea of what sort of reasoning those people use. Where is it in your thinking?
Yeah, well, I can give you a very good example because I used to believe that. I was one. And it's quite a reasonable position to find yourself in, because in our culture, you're brought up through the education system. You're taught all these things about deep time and evolution of the earth and animals and so on. So you don't go to school thinking, is my teacher lying to me? I mean, you know, we learn in trust, right? And I'm not suggesting, by the way, that teachers are necessarily lying. They're simply teaching what they learnt themselves, so it propagates. So you then come to the point of realising, as I did, that there's a massive mismatch here between what the Bible says and what I've been taught and what I see on documentaries and so on. So which is true? And I think young people are encountering that mismatch earlier and earlier. Now, like you're encountering in 10-year-olds, and it took me until, you know, I'm too embarrassed to admit how long, but anyway, it took me a long time to wake up that there was ever a problem. In fact, it was really, I will confess, it was the end of my postgraduate work that I really was confronted over this whole issue. And the thing that different people get to the end point in different ways. For me, it was the realisation that you cannot attribute suffering and death to a good God. That made me realise that you cannot have death in the world before Adam. And that means evolution is theologically impossible. You can posit the idea that there was animal death and all this sort of stuff happening for millions of years, and then there's this herd of hominids and God just picked two of them and they became Adam and Eve. But that creates a whole host of intractable problems, not the least of which is no biblical support for the idea. But you suddenly have these two people who now suddenly are immortal, so long as they don't sin, right? Because death came as a result of their sin. But members of their family are all around them, all dying, and all being eaten by things on the prairie and what have you, right? And God says it's all very good. You know, it's bizarre. It is a bizarre picture. So why do people adhere to theistic evolution? I think for a number of reasons. Some of them might be a fear of man, because you have to be right out there, you know, to believe that the world, the universe is 6,000 Earth years old. I say Earth years for good reason, but because the Bible's written from a observer's perspective here on earth. In fact, you just get laughed at. You know, that's ridiculous. But if you think about it, Christians also believe that a bloke who'd been dead for 3 days got up. And we also believe that a virgin conceived and bore a child. So we're already out there on the edge, right? So a little bit further out, it's probably not really that much of a problem. And that's why I say in my illustrations here that it always takes faith. We cannot apprehend God intellectually. You do take a step where you choose to believe. But if you choose to believe what the Bible says, you have a very, coherent understanding and picture of the world around you that's consistent with what we observe and consistent with the nature of man and why the world is the way it is, why bad stuff's in the world. But if you have the evolutionary view, a theistic evolutionary view, you have some major issues. For instance, why do bad things happen if God is a good God? Now, I could never answer that question because I didn't understand that God didn't make the world a mess. He created it perfectly. It was our sin that brought the mess into the world. That's why you have a good God and a messy world. The theistic evolutionist has no way of coherently bridging that gap. You also don't understand, when I was a young man, I couldn't understand why did Jesus die? I asked the leadership in my church and I got all sorts of answers, one of which was he came up against institutionalised sin. So I thought about that. What about the people who came up against slavery, prostitution, their deaths, and there were many, didn't pay the price for all mankind's sin? There was something different about Jesus. And the difference was, of course, as Paul summarises it, as in Adam all die, even so in Christ shall all be made alive. So it makes sense of the gospel. Everything fell into place when you understand that the Bible actually is true. So fear of man is a big issue, a major one, I think, and I think there could be others, but also people get deceived. There are a lot of very clever schemes that try and fit millions of years into the Bible, and people are publishing books, and lots of money gets invested in that, but it's very, very deceptive. If something is contrary to the Word of God, then you can rest assured it is wrong. Maybe one last one, and then we'll break for supper. Yes?
If you look at the, particularly digestive systems of animals, like herbivores versus carnivores, but in the beginning there was no death, how do you explain animals that are clearly designed for, digesting meat?
Yeah, okay, very good question. So the question is, how do you explain animals that are designed to eat meat? If right at the beginning there was no death of animals, and in fact the Bible expressly says in Genesis chapter 1 that all the animals and man were given plants to eat. I think there are a couple of things to look at there. First of all, you've got to remember God had foreknowledge of the fall, and animals were designed to be able to adapt to changing environments. So there's a considerable amount of resilience and redundancy built into the genetic code, which is what adaptation is about. Had he not done that, the slightest change in the environment would have led to the extinction of all the animals if they were so very finely tuned. So there's lots of resilience. Second thing to note is that there is a lot of evidence where animals that are traditionally omnivores, carnivores, can in fact be herbivores and survive. If you go onto our website, there's an article about the lion that would not eat meat. So this is a lion raised in a zoo, but he was only ever fed vegetables and rice and what have you, and when offered meat, just turned his head away, wasn't interested. So it shows that animals can survive on a vegetable diet. There's a shark that was injured, taken into an aquarium. It had an injured mouth, so it couldn't eat other fish. It was fed cabbages and vegetables, and in fact it survived very well, and then lost interest in fish. Reminds me of Finding Nemo, you know, fish are friends, right? So what we see today is a broken, fallen version of the original creation, and one where there's been considerable adaptation in creatures. So, you know, for instance, you find lions today are able to interbreed with tigers. So you have ligers and they're fertile, which tells us that tigers and lions are from the one original created big cat kind. So there's been enormous variation that's taken place within that kind. But have a look at the Answers book. There's a chapter in there on those sorts of things. I just can't remember the name of the chapter for the moment, but you'll find it there. So look, thank you very much, folks. We've just gone past 9. Let me hand back to Paul now. There he is over there. And I just want to thank you very much, encourage you to get equipped with the resources. And I didn't mention, by the way, if you're already a magazine subscriber, if you can extend your subscription, and that makes you eligible for the bonus gifts that I described earlier. So thanks again for your attention. It's been a great privilege to be here tonight. Over to Paul. Thank you.